Boy cried at his mother's grave, begging to go with her. Then a golden retriever appeared. 1 month had passed since Rebecca's death, yet the world moved on as if nothing had changed. Snow clung stubbornly to the barren branches of the old oak tree standing guard over her grave, its twisted limbs reaching toward the gray sky, heavy with the threat of more snow. The cemetery lay quiet, blanketed in cold silence, broken only by the faint whisper of the wind that carried the scent of frost and distant pine. Ethan stood before his mother's headstone, his small frame shivering against the icy air. His cheeks were flushed pink from the cold, but the tears that stained his face were warm, burning tracks down his skin before freezing into delicate crystals. His breath came out in short, visible puffs, each one trembling with the sobs he tried to hold back. "Mom," he choked, his voice breaking. "I miss you so much." His words echoed softly before being swallowed by the wind. He traced the engraving on the headstone with his fingers, his touch delicate, as if afraid to disturb her name. Rebecca Williams, beloved wife and mother. The stone was cold beneath his fingertips, unyielding and distant, just like the reality that his mother was gone forever. His knees buckled and he sank into the snow, uncaring of the wet chill that seeped through his jeans. "Why did you leave me?" he whispered, his shoulders shaking. "I don't know how to be without you. I don't want to." The words tumbled from his lips, raw and unfiltered, the honest confession of a heart shattered too young. He wrapped his arms around himself, trying to hold together the pieces that felt like they were falling apart with every breath. He remembered the warmth of her embrace, the way she used to hum softly when she held him close, her voice like a lullaby that made everything bad disappear. But that warmth was gone now, leaving only the cold, empty ache that gnawed at his chest. "Take me with you," he sobbed, his voice muffled as he pressed his face into his arms. "Please, I don't want to stay here without you." The wind howled softly, its mournful whisper carrying his plea into the vast, uncaring sky. For a moment, he thought he heard her voice, gentle and soothing, but it was only the rustling of the tree branches above. Loneliness crashed over him, drowning him in a wave of grief that felt endless. The world around him was colorless, the cemetery stretching out in a sea of white and gray, silent and still, as if frozen in time. He wished he could freeze too. Stop feeling, stop hurting, stop existing in this place where she was no longer by his side. A soft sound broke through the numbness. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it pulled Ethan from his sorrow, his head lifting just enough to see the source. At the edge of the cemetery, standing beneath the twisted branches of the oak tree, was a golden retriever. Its fur was matted with snow, patches of frost clinging to its coat, but its eyes were warm. A deep, soulful amber that watched him with quiet understanding. The dog's head tilted slightly, its gaze unwavering as it took a tentative step forward. Ethan blinked, his tears blurring the golden shape before him. He hastily wiped his face with his sleeve, his vision clearing just in time to see the dog draw closer, its movements slow and cautious as if sensing his pain. He stared at the animal, confusion flickering through his grief. It seemed out of place in the cold cemetery, its golden fur glowing softly against the white snow, like a drop of sunlight in a world of shadows. The dog stopped a few feet away, lowering its head in a gesture of gentleness. It didn't bark or whine. It simply stood there, watching him with those amber eyes that were so full of something Ethan couldn't quite name. Comfort, compassion, love. His heart twisted, and a sob escaped before he could stop it. The dog's ears perked, and it took another step forward, its nose brushing against Ethan's knee. Its fur was cold, but the touch was warm, grounding him to the present. Ethan's fingers trembled as he reached out, his hand hesitating just above the dog's head. "Where did you come from?" he whispered, his voice shaking. The dog leaned into his touch, its body pressing softly against him, a solid presence in the emptiness that surrounded him. He buried his fingers in its fur, feeling the softness beneath the frost. It was real, warm, alive, breathing. Something about the dog's closeness soothed the ache inside him, easing the weight that had settled over his heart since his mother's death. He sank into the snow again, his arms wrapping instinctively around the dog's neck, his face pressing into its fur as his tears flowed freely. The dog stayed still, unmoving except for the slow, steady rise and fall of its chest. Ethan felt its heartbeat, strong and constant, echoing through his own body, calming the storm within him. "You're here," he murmured, his voice muffled. "You came when I was all alone." The dog let out a low whine, its head nuzzling closer to him, warm breath brushing against his cheek. Ethan closed his eyes, his grip tightening as if afraid the dog would disappear, just like his mother. But it stayed, solid and steadfast, grounding him to the earth beneath his knees. The snow continued to fall, soft flakes drifting down from the sky, landing on his hair and shoulders. But Ethan didn't feel the cold anymore. All he felt was the warmth of the golden retriever, a presence that seemed to fill the emptiness inside him, chasing away the shadows of his grief. For the first time since his mother's funeral, the tears that fell were not from pain alone, but from the fragile spark of hope that flickered within him. Ethan pulled back, his eyes meeting the dog's amber gaze. He saw himself reflected in those eyes, his pain and loneliness mirrored back at him, but also something more, a promise of understanding, of companionship, of healing. "I don't know who you are," Ethan whispered, his fingers still buried in the dog's fur. "But thank you. Thank you for coming to me." The dog's tail wagged slowly, a gentle sweep against the snow, its eyes softening. Ethan smiled through his tears, his heart aching and mending all at once. I think I'll call you Miracle," he said softly. The name felt right, like an echo of his mother's voice whispering through the wind. Miracle leaned forward, pressing its cold nose to his cheek, a gesture of affection that sent warmth flooding through Ethan's chest. In that moment, he felt his mother's presence surrounding him, a gentle embrace carried on the breeze. For the first time since she left, Ethan didn't feel so alone. The golden retriever sat beside him, a silent guardian in the snow, and together they watched the sky as snowflakes danced around them, whispering of hope and miracles yet to come. Ethan walked home with Miracle trotting beside him, the golden retriever's fur still dusted with snowflakes that sparkled under the pale winter sun. The cold air stung his cheeks, but he felt warm inside, his heart lighter than it had been in weeks. Miracle stayed close, her amber eyes watching him with unwavering loyalty, as if she had known him all his life. Ethan couldn't help but glance down at her every few steps, still half expecting her to vanish like a dream. But she was real, solid and warm, her paws crunching softly against the snow as they made their way through the quiet streets. His fingers brushed the soft fur on her head, and she leaned into his touch, her tail wagging gently. "You really are a miracle," he murmured, a smile breaking through the sadness that had settled on his face for so long. As they approached his house, Ethan's steps slowed, his heart tightening with unease. The two-story house stood silent and cold, its windows blank and empty, a shell of the home it once was. Since his mother's death, the house felt haunted, each room echoing with memories that seemed too painful to face. Ethan swallowed hard, his eyes drifting to the living room window, where his mother used to wave to him every day after school, her smile bright and warm. But the window was empty now, the curtains drawn, shadows lurking behind the glass. He shivered, the warmth in his chest fading, replaced by the familiar ache of loss. Miracle nudged his leg, her nose cold and wet against his skin, grounding him to the present. She looked up at him, her eyes soft with understanding, and Ethan felt a surge of courage. He took a deep breath, his fingers tightening in her fur. "Come on, Miracle," he whispered, his voice trembling. "Let's go home." They walked up the porch steps, the wood creaking beneath their weight, and Ethan hesitated at the door. His heart raced as he reached for the handle, his mind flashing back to the last time his mother had opened this door, her laughter ringing out as she welcomed him inside, her arms warm and safe around him. He closed his eyes, pushing the memory away before it could drown him. Miracle whined softly, her tail brushing against his leg, a gentle reminder that he wasn't alone. Ethan swallowed the lump in his throat and opened the door, stepping inside with Miracle at his heels. The house was cold and dim, the air stale and heavy, as if it had been holding its breath since the day Rebecca died. Shadows clung to the walls, curling around the corners like ghosts, whispering of all that was lost. Ethan's chest tightened, his eyes drawn to the staircase where his mother used to sit, waiting to listen to his stories about school. But now the stairs were empty, silent, dust gathering on the wooden steps. Miracle walked in slowly, her paws patting softly against the floor as she explored the unfamiliar space. She sniffed the air, her nose twitching as she took in the scents of the house. Ethan watched her, his heart pounding as she wandered into the living room. He followed, his feet dragging, as he stepped into the room that held the most memories. The sunlight filtered weakly through the curtains, casting pale shadows on the carpet where his mother used to play with him, her laughter filling the room with light. The couch where she would curl up with a book still had the indents of her favorite spot. The blanket she always used folded neatly on the armrest. Ethan's vision blurred, his throat tightening as he stood frozen, the ache in his chest growing sharper. But then Miracle jumped onto the couch, curling up in the exact spot where his mother used to sit. Her golden fur glowed softly in the sunlight, her body warm and alive against the cold emptiness that filled the room. She looked at him, her eyes gentle and steady, as if inviting him to join her. Ethan's heart skipped, his breath catching as he realized that the room didn't feel as empty anymore. It was still cold and shadowed, but Miracle's presence seemed to chase away the darkness, her warmth bringing life back into the space that had been hollow for so long. He walked over slowly, his legs heavy, and sat beside her, his body sinking into the familiar cushions. Miracle rested her head on his lap, her eyes closing as she let out a soft sigh of contentment. Ethan's fingers moved to her fur, stroking her gently, his touch light and tentative. The softness under his fingertips soothed him, grounding him in the present, easing the ache in his heart. He leaned back, his head resting against the cushions, and closed his eyes. For the first time since his mother's death, the house didn't feel so cold. The sound of the front door opening shattered the peace, and Ethan's eyes flew open, his heart jumping as his father's voice echoed through the hallway. "Ethan?" David's footsteps were heavy, his voice gruff and tired. "You home?" Panic surged through Ethan as he looked at Miracle, who had lifted her head, her ears perked in curiosity. He hadn't thought about what his father would say about bringing a dog home, especially not now, with everything still so raw and fragile between them. David walked into the living room, his face drawn and weary, dark circles under his eyes from sleepless nights filled with grief and loneliness. He froze in the doorway, his gaze locking onto the golden retriever curled up beside his son. His expression darkened, his jaw tightening as his eyes hardened. "Ethan," he said slowly, his voice cold and controlled, "where did that dog come from?" Ethan swallowed, his mouth suddenly dry. I I found her," he stammered, his arms instinctively wrapping around Miracle, as if to protect her. "She was at the cemetery. She was all alone. I couldn't leave her there." David's eyes flicked to Miracle, his expression softening for a brief moment before his shoulders tensed, his face hardening once more. "You should have come straight home," he snapped, his voice sharp. "You know better than to bring stray animals into the house." Miracle's ears drooped, her body curling into Ethan's lap as if sensing David's anger. Ethan felt his heart twist, his fingers stroking her fur protectively. "But Dad, she was so cold, and she looked so sad." His voice wavered, his eyes pleading as he looked up at his father. "I named her Miracle because she came when I needed her the most." David's face fell, his eyes flicking to his son's tear-streaked cheeks, the vulnerability in Ethan's gaze cutting through his anger. But he shook his head, his hands clenching into fists. "We can't keep her," he said firmly, his voice cracking. We can't have any more reminders in this house. Not now. Not when everything is already—" His voice trailed off, his eyes glazing with pain before he turned away, his shoulders stiff. "Take her back outside. She can't stay." Ethan's heart shattered, his chest tightening as he looked down at Miracle, who watched him with trusting eyes, her tail thumping softly against the couch. "No," Ethan whispered, his arms tightening around her. "I can't let her go. She, she saved me, Dad. She made me feel warm again. David's shoulders shook, his hands gripping the doorframe. He didn't turn around, his voice low and strained. We can't save everything that's broken, Ethan. He walked away, his footsteps heavy and uneven as he disappeared down the hall, leaving Ethan alone with Miracle, the cold creeping back into the room. Ethan buried his face in Miracle's fur, his tears soaking into her golden coat as she stayed by his side, silent and steadfast, refusing to leave him. That night, Ethan lay curled up in his bed, his blankets pulled tightly around him. But no amount of fabric could chase away the cold emptiness that filled his room. Shadows danced on the walls, twisting into shapes that looked too much like memories he wanted to forget. He shut his eyes, trying to block them out. But every time he did, he saw his mother's face, smiling softly, her eyes bright with warmth and love. His chest tightened, the ache spreading until it was hard to breathe. He squeezed his pillow, his fingers digging into the fabric as his body shook with silent sobs. The house was quiet, the kind of heavy silence that settled over everything since Rebecca's death. It felt suffocating, the stillness pressing down on him, wrapping around him like invisible chains. He wanted to scream, to shatter the silence, but the sound stuck in his throat, his voice lost somewhere deep inside the hollow space his mother left behind. A soft whine broke through the darkness, and Ethan's eyes snapped open, his heart leaping in his chest. Miracle's golden head peeked through the crack in his bedroom door, her amber eyes glowing softly in the dim light. She looked at him, her gaze gentle and warm, her tail wagging hesitantly as if asking for permission to enter. Ethan sat up, wiping his tears with the back of his hand. He hadn't expected her to stay after what his father had said, but there she was, waiting for him, her body trembling slightly as she stood in the hallway, alone. His chest tightened, the ache shifting into something softer, something that made his heart feel heavy and light all at once. "Miracle," he whispered, his voice hoarse. The dog's ears perked, and she stepped into the room, her paws making soft thuds on the carpet as she crossed the floor. She stopped beside his bed, her head resting on the mattress as she looked up at him with those soulful eyes, filled with worry and love. Ethan felt his throat tighten, his fingers reaching out instinctively, burying themselves in her fur. It was warm and soft, grounding him to the present, keeping the shadows at bay. He let out a shaky breath, his shoulders relaxing as Miracle leaned into his touch, her nose nudging his arm gently. "You stayed," he murmured, his fingers trembling. "Even when he told you to leave, you stayed with me." Miracle's tail thumped softly against the floor, her eyes never leaving his face, as if she understood every word. Ethan felt tears prickle at the corners of his eyes, but this time, they didn't hurt as much. He slid over, making room on the bed, and Miracle jumped up, her body curling beside his, warm and solid against his side. He rested his head against her shoulder, his cheek pressed to her fur, his fingers curling into her coat as his eyes drifted shut. Miracle's steady breathing lulled him, the rhythmic rise and fall of her chest soothing the ache in his heart. He felt his body relax, the tension melting away as he listened to her heartbeat, steady and strong, echoing through him like a lullaby. For the first time since his mother's funeral, Ethan felt safe. He closed his eyes, his fingers still tangled in Miracle's fur, his breathing evening out as sleep claimed him. Down the hall, David sat alone at the kitchen table, his hands wrapped around a mug of cold coffee, untouched since he poured it hours ago. The house was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow above the stove, casting shadows across the room. David stared at the mug, his vision unfocused, his mind a blur of thoughts and memories that refused to leave him. He could still see Rebecca's smile, the way her eyes sparkled when she laughed, the warmth in her voice when she said his name. But those memories were tangled with the image of her lying still and cold in that hospital bed, her hands slipping out of his as she took her last breath. His chest tightened, pain spreading through him, sharp and relentless. He closed his eyes, his fist clenching as he tried to push it down, to bury it deep where he wouldn't have to feel it. But the pain refused to be silenced, the weight of his grief crushing him, making it hard to breathe. He opened his eyes, his gaze drifting to the hallway, his heart twisting as he thought of Ethan, his son who had the same eyes as Rebecca, the same gentle smile. David's shoulders sagged, guilt washing over him as he remembered the hurt in Ethan's voice when he asked to keep the dog. He knew he'd been too harsh, but he couldn't bear the thought of letting another piece of warmth into this house, not when everything reminded him of her. He was afraid to love again, afraid to lose again. But in his fear, he was losing Ethan too. He ran a hand over his face, his fingers trembling as he tried to steady himself. His eyes drifted to the living room, where Miracle's golden fur had glowed softly in the sunlight, her presence filling the room with warmth that he hadn't felt in so long. It had reminded him of Rebecca, of the way she could light up a room just by being there. And maybe that was why he couldn't let the dog stay. Because every time he looked at her, he felt his heart crack a little more, the pain of loss cutting deeper. But he'd seen the way Ethan held her, the way his son's eyes softened, the light returning to his face for the first time since the accident. Miracle had brought Ethan back from the darkness, had given him a reason to smile, again. And David had almost taken that away. His chest tightened, shame burning in his throat as he realized how selfish he'd been. Ethan needed Miracle, needed the comfort and love she gave him, needed a reason to believe in hope again. David stood slowly, his body heavy with exhaustion and regret. He walked down the hall, his footsteps silent as he stopped outside Ethan's door. It was cracked open, a sliver of light spilling into the hallway. He peeked inside, his breath catching as he saw his son curled up with Miracle, his face peaceful, his hand resting on the dog's golden fur. Miracle's head lifted, her eyes meeting David's through the darkness, a silent plea in her gaze. She didn't move, didn't make a sound, but her eyes softened, her tail wagging once, slow and steady, as if to say, "He's safe. I'll protect him." David's throat tightened, his vision blurring as he watched them, his heart aching with love and longing. He leaned against the doorframe, his shoulders sagging as the weight of his grief finally broke. For the first time since Rebecca died, David allowed himself to cry. He sank to the floor, his back against the wall, his body shaking with silent sobs as he grieved for the woman he lost and the son he was losing. And as his tears fell, the golden retriever watched him through the darkness, her amber eyes filled with understanding and love. Morning light crept through Ethan's window, delicate beams of gold that danced across his face, coaxing him from the depths of sleep. He stirred, his body warm and cocooned in soft fur. For a brief, blissful moment, he forgot everything, the accident, the funeral, the hollow ache that had taken up residence in his chest. All he felt was comfort, a warmth that cradled him, a steady heartbeat beneath his cheek. He opened his eyes to find Miracle curled beside him, her golden coat gleaming softly in the sunlight, her body pressed protectively against his. Her eyes fluttered open, amber pools reflecting his sleepy gaze. Her tail thumped once, twice against the mattress, a gentle rhythm that made Ethan's heart swell. A smile tugged at his lips, soft and tender, the first real smile he had felt in what seemed like a lifetime. "Good morning, Miracle," he whispered, his voice rough with sleep. Miracle let out a small huff, her nose nudging his cheek in response, her body warm and solid, anchoring him to this moment. Ethan buried his fingers in her fur, his touch light and reverent, his heart full of gratitude. Miracle's eyes softened, her tail wagging again, as if she understood how much she meant to him. For the first time since his mother's death, Ethan didn't wake up feeling alone. He closed his eyes, pressing his face into Miracle's fur, letting her warmth chase away the shadows that still lingered in the corners of his mind. But the peace was short-lived. Heavy footsteps echoed down the hall, and Ethan's body tensed, his heart dropping as he remembered his father's words from the night before. "We can't keep her." The pain resurfaced, sharp and cold, twisting in his chest like a knife. Miracle looked up, her ears perking as the footsteps grew louder, her body pressing closer to Ethan as if sensing his fear. The door creaked open, and David stood in the doorway, his face shadowed, eyes bloodshot from a night of grief and restless sleep. He looked at Ethan, then at Miracle curled protectively around his son, her eyes watching him with wary caution. David's shoulders stiffened, his mouth pressing into a thin line as he stepped into the room. Ethan's arms tightened around Miracle, his eyes wide and pleading. "Please, Dad, don't make her leave." His voice broke, the words trembling with desperation. "I need her." David's chest tightened, the raw vulnerability in Ethan's voice cutting through his anger, leaving him breathless. He looked at his son, truly looked at him for the first time in weeks, and saw how thin and fragile he had become, his eyes hollow, face pale from sleepless nights and unspoken pain. Guilt twisted in David's gut, sharp and unforgiving. He had been so consumed by his own grief, his own heartache, that he had failed to see how deeply Ethan was hurting, how lost and broken he had become. David's gaze shifted to Miracle, her body curled protectively around his son, her eyes filled with quiet understanding. She didn't move, didn't make a sound, just watched him with a steady, unyielding gaze that seemed to see right through him. David swallowed, his throat tight. He had wanted to push her away, to banish any reminder of the warmth and love that had once filled this house. But looking at her now, he realized she wasn't a reminder of what was lost. She was a bridge to what remained. She was the thread that tied them to Rebecca, to the love and laughter they once shared. She was hope, wrapped in golden fur and amber eyes. David's shoulders sagged, the weight of his anger and fear crumbling beneath the truth that stared back at him. He ran a hand over his face, his fingers trembling as he struggled to find his voice. "Ethan," he began, his voice rough, cracking under the weight of emotion. I didn't realize how much you were hurting." His eyes dropped to the floor, shame burning in his chest. "I was so wrapped up in my own pain. I didn't see yours." Ethan's eyes widened, his arms loosening around Miracle as he looked up at his father, his heart pounding. He had never heard his dad sound so broken, so vulnerable. David took a shaky breath, his shoulders trembling. "I miss her too," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Every day, every moment. I miss her." His hands curled into fists, his body tense as he tried to hold himself together. I thought if I shut everything out, if I stayed numb, it wouldn't hurt as much." He looked up, his eyes wet and shining with unshed tears. "But it did. It hurt more. And I hurt you because of it. I'm so sorry, Ethan." The room was silent, the air heavy with unspoken words, raw and fragile. Ethan's heart thudded in his chest, his vision blurring as tears filled his eyes. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat, tangled with grief and relief and love. Miracle let out a soft whine, her head resting on Ethan's lap, her eyes drifting between father and son, her body still and patient, as if waiting for the walls to fall. David took a step closer, his body trembling as he sank to his knees beside the bed, his head bowed, shoulders shaking. "I didn't want to let her in," he choked, his voice breaking, "because I was afraid to feel again, afraid to lose again." He looked up, his gaze locking with Ethan's, his face raw and open. "But you need her, and I think I do too." Ethan's breath hitched, his heart aching as he reached out, his fingers brushing against his father's shoulder. "I miss her, Dad," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I miss her so much." David's face crumpled, his eyes closing as tears spilled over, his body shaking with silent sobs. "Me too," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I miss her every day." Ethan slid off the bed, his arms wrapping around his father, his face pressed into his shoulder as the dam broke, the tears flowing freely. David held him, his grip tight and desperate, his body trembling as he finally let himself grieve. Miracle climbed off the bed, her body curling around them, her head resting on David's knee, her eyes soft and steady, her presence grounding them to this moment. They stayed like that for a long time, tangled together, their tears mingling, the walls crumbling, the distance between them shrinking. And when the tears finally dried, when the silence was no longer heavy with pain, David looked at Miracle, his fingers brushing her fur, his eyes filled with gratitude. "Welcome home, Miracle," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. Miracle's tail thumped against the floor, her eyes bright and shining with love as she leaned into his touch, her warmth chasing away the cold shadows that had lingered far too long. Ethan's laughter echoed through the house, a sound so foreign and bright that it seemed to chase away the shadows clinging to the walls. Miracle bounded around the living room, her golden fur gleaming in the afternoon sunlight, her tail a blur of motion as she darted around the couch, her playful barks filling the space with warmth. Ethan chased after her, his face alight with joy, his feet barely touching the floor as he raced around the room, his laughter spilling out in breathless bursts. It had been so long since he'd felt this way, light, carefree, his heart unburdened by the weight of grief. He didn't realize how much he needed this until the laughter broke free, chasing away the cold emptiness that had settled in his chest. Miracle darted behind the armchair, her body low, eyes bright with mischief as she peeked out from behind the fabric, her tail wagging furiously. Ethan grinned, his heart soaring as he crept toward her, his hands outstretched. "I've got you now," he shouted, his voice playful, teasing. Miracle let out a bark, her body springing into motion as she dashed away, her paws skidding on the hardwood floor as she dodged his outstretched arms. Ethan laughed, his body twisting as he tried to keep up, his heart pounding with exhilaration. "You're fast, Miracle," he called, his voice breathless, his face flushed with happiness. From the doorway, David watched them, his heart aching with a bittersweet mixture of joy and sorrow. It had been so long since he'd heard Ethan laugh, so long since he'd seen that light in his son's eyes. For weeks, Ethan had been a shadow of himself, lost in grief, his face pale, his eyes hollow, his body weighed down by the pain of losing his mother. David's chest tightened as he remembered all the nights he heard Ethan crying himself to sleep. All the mornings he found his son sitting alone at the kitchen table, his gaze distant, his voice quiet and broken. He had been so consumed by his own pain, his own sorrow, that he had failed to see how deeply Ethan was hurting. But watching him now, laughing and smiling, his face alight with joy as he played with Miracle, David felt something inside him begin to heal. The walls he had built around his heart started to crumble, the cold emptiness that had filled his chest slowly giving way to warmth. Miracle was doing what David couldn't. She was healing Ethan, mending the cracks in his heart with her playful spirit and unwavering love. She had brought laughter back into their home, had filled the empty spaces with her warmth and light. She had given them hope. David's throat tightened, his eyes stinging with tears, as he watched his son race around the living room, his laughter ringing out, his body glowing with life. It was the first time their house felt like a home again. Ethan spun around, his eyes locking onto his father's figure standing in the doorway, his smile faltering for a moment before widening, his eyes shining with excitement. "Dad, did you see that? Miracle so fast. I almost had her, but she got away." His voice was breathless, his cheeks flushed, his hair tousled from running. David's heart swelled, his lips curving into a smile, his chest aching with love and pride. He took a step into the room, his arms crossing over his chest as he leaned against the wall, his eyes soft as he watched his son. "I saw," he said, his voice warm, his eyes sparkling. "You almost got her, but she's pretty quick, huh?" Ethan's eyes widened, his head nodding furiously. "Yeah, she's the fastest dog I've ever seen." He laughed, his body vibrating with energy. Miracle let out a bark, her tail wagging as she jumped up, her paws landing on Ethan's chest, her tongue darting out to lick his face. Ethan giggled, his arms wrapping around her as he fell back onto the couch, his body curling around her as they tumbled into a pile of golden fur and laughter. David's chest tightened, his eyes burning as he watched them, his heart aching with a mixture of love and longing. It had been so long since he'd seen Ethan this happy, so long since he'd heard his son's laughter. It felt like a miracle. He took a deep breath, his shoulders sagging as the weight of his grief lifted, replaced by hope and love. He walked over to the couch, his fingers reaching out, his hand resting on Miracle's head, his touch light and reverent. Miracle looked up at him, her amber eyes warm and understanding, her tail thumping softly against the cushions. She leaned into his touch, her body pressing closer, her warmth seeping into his skin, easing the ache in his chest. David's throat tightened, his fingers trembling as he stroked her fur, his heart overflowing with gratitude. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. Thank you for bringing him back to me. Miracle's eyes softened, her body stilling as she pressed her head against his palm, her warmth wrapping around him, steady and grounding. Ethan looked up, his eyes wide, his face softening as he watched his father and Miracle, his heart swelling with love. He reached out, his hand resting on his father's arm, his voice gentle. "She saved me, Dad," he whispered, his voice trembling. "She saved us." David's eyes filled with tears, his vision blurring as he looked at his son, his heart breaking and healing all at once. He sank down onto the couch, his arms wrapping around Ethan and Miracle, his body curling around them, his chest shaking with silent sobs. They stayed like that for a long time, tangled together in a heap of limbs and fur, their hearts beating in sync, their tears mingling as they held each other close. David's walls crumbled, his heart opening as he allowed himself to feel again, to love again. He let himself remember Rebecca, her laughter, her smile, the way she used to curl up on this very couch with Ethan, their faces bright with joy as they watched cartoons together. He let himself grieve, let himself cry for all that he had lost, all that he would never have again. But he also let himself feel hope, let himself see the light in Ethan's eyes, the warmth in Miracle's gaze. He let himself believe that maybe, just maybe, they could heal together. He held them tighter, his body trembling as he whispered, "I love you, Ethan. I love you so much." Ethan's arms tightened around him, his voice muffled as he buried his face in his father's shoulder. "I love you too, Dad." Miracle let out a soft whine, her body curling closer, her eyes closing as she sighed, her warmth enveloping them, her presence grounding them to this moment. They stayed that way, wrapped in each other's love, their hearts beating as one, the shadows finally chased away by the light that Miracle had brought into their lives. The air was crisp, the sky a pale shade of blue that stretched endlessly above them, dotted with soft drifting clouds. Snow blanketed the cemetery, a pristine layer of white that sparkled under the winter sun, untouched and pure. Ethan stood before his mother's grave, his hands buried deep in his coat pockets, his breath visible in the cold air. He shivered, but it wasn't from the chill. It was the familiar ache, the hollow feeling that always came when he visited this place, the place where his mother lay beneath the frozen earth. But this time the ache wasn't as sharp. It was still there, lingering in his chest, but it was softened, dulled by the warmth that stood by his side. Miracle sat close to him, her golden fur glowing softly in the sunlight, her body pressed against his leg, solid and real. She looked up at him, her amber eyes gentle, her tail sweeping slowly across the snow. A steady rhythm that grounded him, kept him from being swallowed by the grief that still lingered. Ethan took a deep breath, his chest tightening as his eyes traced the letters carved into the cold stone. Rebecca Williams, beloved wife and mother. His vision blurred, his throat tightening as the words sank in, the finality of them heavy and suffocating. But he didn't look away. He owed her that much. "Hi, Mom," he whispered, his voice trembling, his breath a white cloud that hung in the air before fading away. I brought Miracle with me today. I think you would have loved her." Miracle let out a soft whine, her nose nudging his hand, her eyes watching him with quiet understanding. Ethan's fingers tangled in her fur, his grip tight, as if afraid she would disappear, just like his mother. But Miracle stayed, her body warm and steady against his side, her presence a comforting weight that kept him grounded. She saved me, Mom," Ethan continued, his voice breaking. I thought I couldn't go on without you. I thought I was all alone. But Miracle, she found me, just when I needed her the most." He looked down at the golden retriever, his eyes softening as he watched her tail wag, her head tilting as if she were listening to every word. "She's my Miracle," he whispered, his heart aching and healing all at once. "Just like you were." His shoulders shook, tears slipping down his cheeks warm against the cold air. But this time, the tears didn't burn as much. They were softer, gentler, an acceptance of what was lost and a promise to carry her memory forward. He wiped his face with his sleeve, his fingers trembling as he looked back at the headstone, his heart thudding painfully in his chest. "I miss you every day," he choked, his voice cracking. "I miss your smile, your laugh, the way you always made everything feel safe." His knees buckled and he sank into the snow, his hands still tangled in Miracle's fur, his body curling into itself as the weight of his grief pressed down on him. Miracle whimpered, her nose brushing his cheek, her body wrapping around him, a shield against the cold and the pain. Ethan closed his eyes, his face buried in her fur, his tears soaking into the golden strands as his shoulders shook. "I'm trying to be strong," he sobbed, his voice muffled, "but it's so hard without you." Miracle stayed with him, her body warm and solid, her breathing slow and steady, a constant rhythm that grounded him, kept him from falling apart. Her tail thumped softly against the snow, her presence wrapping around him like a blanket, a promise that he wasn't alone. Ethan's breathing evened out, his body relaxing as Miracle's warmth seeped into him, melting the icy ache in his chest. He took a shaky breath, his fingers tightening in her fur as he looked up at the headstone, his vision clearing, his heart steady. "I'm going to be okay, Mom," he whispered, his voice soft but strong. "I have Miracle now, and I have Dad. We're getting through this together." A cold breeze swept through the cemetery, stirring the snowflakes around them, swirling them into delicate patterns that danced in the sunlight. Ethan shivered, his eyes following the snowflakes as they drifted through the air, his heart skipping as he imagined he could hear his mother's laughter in the wind. "I love you, Mom," he choked, his voice cracking. "I'll never stop loving you." The wind sighed, rustling the branches above, carrying his words into the sky, up to the heavens where he liked to think his mother was watching over him. He closed his eyes, his lips trembling, as he felt a warmth settle over him, gentle and familiar, like his mother's arms wrapping around him, her voice whispering through the breeze. "I'm proud of you, my sweet boy." Ethan's heart swelled, his chest aching with love and loss, hope and grief, all tangled together in a bittersweet harmony. He took a deep breath, his body relaxing as the warmth lingered, filling him with the strength to keep moving forward. Miracle nuzzled his cheek, her tail wagging as she licked his face, her eyes bright and loving. Ethan laughed, his voice shaky, his fingers brushing her fur as he looked down at her, his heart overflowing with gratitude. "Come on, Miracle," he whispered, his voice soft and tender. "Let's go home." He stood slowly, his legs shaky, his hands still resting on Miracle's back as he turned away from the grave, his eyes lingering on his mother's name one last time before he took a step forward. Miracle walked beside him, her body pressed against his, her presence steady and grounding as they moved through the snow, leaving behind footprints that wove together, a trail of love and healing. At the edge of the cemetery, Ethan stopped, his heart tightening as he looked back, his breath hitching as he whispered, "Goodbye, Mom." The wind whispered through the trees, a soft murmur that seemed to carry her voice, a gentle promise that she was still with him, always. Ethan smiled, his heart light as he turned back to the path, his steps steady, his hand resting on Miracle's back. They walked home together, their shadows stretched long against the snow, two souls intertwined by love and loss, hope and healing. And as they disappeared down the path, the sun broke through the clouds, casting a golden light over the cemetery, warming the snow-covered ground where Rebecca Williams rested, her memory alive in the hearts of those she left behind. This story reminds us that even in the darkest moments of grief, hope can find its way back to us, often in the most unexpected forms. Ethan's journey shows that healing isn't about forgetting those we've lost, but learning to carry their love with us as we move forward. Miracle wasn't just a dog. She was a symbol of resilience, love, and new beginnings. Through her presence, Ethan and David found a way to reconnect, to grieve together, and to rebuild their family with memories that honored Rebecca's life. It's a powerful reminder that love never truly leaves us. It changes form and continues to guide us, even when the pain feels unbearable. If this story touched your heart, please consider subscribing to our channel for more emotional and inspiring stories that celebrate hope, healing, and the incredible bonds that shape our lives. Thank you for watching, and remember, You're never truly alone as long as love remains in your heart.